Okay, I have back with me today former CIA Ray McGovern to go over what's going on in the United States, what's going on in Russia, the Ukraine-Russia war. Lots of big news coming out of Poland that we want to discover. Ray, thank you so much for coming on today's show.
Most welcome, Stephen.
So I'm sure you saw these. These are two big stories where we were misled. Russia was blamed for something that Ukraine ended up doing. But were you aware or did you see that Poland has finished their investigation of the missile that was launched that killed two Polish people, and that was actually sent from Ukraine, not from Russia?
I was shocked, Stephen. Actually, I wasn't shocked. This happens all the time. And the Ukrainians, of course, blame the Russians. What's new? Well, there is something new here. The Poles didn't have to acknowledge that the Ukrainians were lying, but they did. And the Poles and the Ukrainians are at loggerheads now. One of the top leaders of Poland at the UN talked about Ukraine as a drowning person. He said, when a person is drowning, as Ukraine is, uh, their energy and their power and their adrenaline is such that you have to be really careful if you're going to try to save this person, and they could drag you down. So that's what Ukraine is now. Whoa! So there is a real dispute between Ukraine and Poland on the selling of wheat from Ukraine. There's also a Polish election coming up in just a few weeks, and this has something to do with that. But there's no gainsaying the fact that just as with Hungary and other countries, Slovakia, the fissures are becoming wider and wider. And Poland, after all, is key. And many Poles are just tired of supporting Ukrainians, helping as they have to their credit, Ukrainian refugees and all that stuff. But they want an end to this, just like many of people in the West, in Europe at large.
So you think that they were willing to expose the truth versus go with the narrative because of the election and because of the upset farmer? Like it is interesting that Poland would tell the truth about Ukraine versus feed into they could have very easily said Russia did this. Now people in Poland have been killed by Russian missiles, but instead they decided to go with the truth.
Yeah, it's unusual, isn't it? Poland decided to go with the truth, but there have been a whole string of indelicate things happening, atrocities, really, like in the Canadian Parliament. My God, that 98-year-old fellow must eat a lot of vegetables because he looked very robust. Poland wants him extradited now to face war criminal proceedings. So does Russia. I mean, hello, this is getting pretty dicey in terms of how strongly Poland feels about people endorsing Nazis, not only in Ottawa but in Kiev as well.
Yeah, I was sitting there thinking, wait a minute, if they've now discovered that this hero was working for the Nazis to kill Russians, like this guy just exposed himself. Like this happened. They found here in America a Nazi that had been hiding. Oh, he was a really
Right?
great neighbor. Well, man, they hauled him out of his house so quickly. Same thing. They would find him hiding in Argentina. And these people, it's like the leader over in Poland said, I cannot believe you applauded this man in Canadian Parliament. He is a Nazi Russian Polish killer. Like we are not going to whitewash this man's history.
Yeah, and Stephen, if you look at the broad swath of history here, it should be, by all rights, not only Poland, not only Russia, it should be Germany that wants him extradited and brought to trial. I mean, let's face it, the Germans are very easily able to emphasize their tight bond with the United States and escape the opprobrium that still exists for generations ago and their activities with respect to Jews, Poles, and other poor folks that suffered under the Third Reich.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting story. And now Canada is trying to remove that meeting as if it never happened, wipe it clean. It's a national embarrassment. I feel bad for the guy, the judge that sits over Parliament. He's now lost his job because of this guy. And the United States and the Western media, they pretend like there aren't Nazis in Ukraine right now. That was like one of the big shockers for me as a small-time journalist, was when I realized, wait a minute, a lot of the people fighting in this war right now are modern day Nazis. Like, they don't hide it. We hide it. The American media hides that these guys are Nazis, but they've got their swastika tattoos, their throat tattoos, they've got their pins. Like, they're out in broad daylight announcing that they still follow Hitler and Bandera.
Yes, and Stephen, it's really interesting how the mainstream media in this country can erase history. I mean, just 6 or 7 years ago, the New York Times were pointing to the Nazis in the Azov battalion. We're talking about these people with the swastikas and other Nazi symbols on them and saying this is a major force in Kiev. All of a sudden, poof, they got the memo. No more of that. As if on one particular day it stopped. And now Americans are, malnourished on real information, including the fact that, Zelensky, even if he wanted to make peace, would have a problem from the other side, from the Nazis in his government. And to see him approve in the Canadian Parliament the role he played and elsewhere, shows that he's not only a tool of the United States, but he's not his own man when it comes to power in his own country.
Yeah. You probably also saw this. There was that small village a few months back where it's like a beautiful morning. People are out shopping. It looks like the opening to the Beauty and the Beast movie, right? Like, if they had been singing, it would have looked like that, right? They're out just shopping, and all of a sudden you see this missile. It explodes. Everyone freaks out. They're saying, why is Putin firing missiles into civilian territory? And then just yesterday, it came out that it was, again, Ukraine firing missiles on their own town. And now a quick message from today's video sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. In 2020, there were over 5 million auto accidents. That's more than 600 an hour. 600 an hour. And those in an accident may be entitled to more than they think. A few years ago, I was injured in an auto accident. At first, I didn't want to hire a lawyer because I felt bad for the woman that hit me. But I learned from the law firm that they would be going after the insurance company to make me whole and not the woman. Morgan & Morgan have modernized the injury law process so you can submit a claim and communicate with your legal team all over the phone. So if you're ever injured in an auto accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. You can submit a claim in 8 clicks or less without having to leave your couch. For more information, go to forthepeople.com/Stephen Gardner or dial #law. That's pound 529 from your cell phone. All right, let's get back to today's news update.
Stephen, the real problem here is how naive, or worse, the mainstream media are. They feed on what the Ukrainians say. They never really admit that these are Ukrainian sources. Even when it comes down to really big issues. Now, let me cite one that comes to mind. When Russian forces went into Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, they scared the bejesus out of the Ukrainians. Ukrainians immediately said, "Let's talk about this. Let's talk." That was exactly what Putin and his colleagues wanted. Well, what happened? Well, surprise, surprise, folks. They did talk. They started talks almost immediately in Belarus and then transitioned to bigger talks in Istanbul. Erdogan played a role in facilitating these things. Even the former premier or prime minister of Israel did. So what eventuated? They came to an agreement on the 31st of March. They agreed, making Ukraine neutral, demilitarizing some of it, making sure that the shelling of Russian ethnic people in the Donbass stopped. It was the agreement that everyone was hoping for under the Minsk agreements, which were sabotaged by the French, by the Germans, and by the U.S. So it looked like we had an agreement on the 1st of April. Everybody, no April Fool's Day here. This was for real. What happened? A week later, Boris Johnson from the UK came into Kiev and said, "Look, you might think you have a deal. We don't deal with Putin. He's a criminal. No deal. We don't agree." Whoa. Now, how does McGovern know that? Ukrainskaya Pravda. I mean, for God's sake, the Ukrainian newspapers were saying exactly what Boris Johnson told was not possible to. So now that was early April, right? 3 days later, Putin said, "Well, look, they put the kibosh on this. It's no longer possible." And since then, you have something like 50,000 young Ukrainians and Russians and others dead. Now, that could have been prevented. It was all set to be prevented. But Ukraine was not what U.S. was interested in. It was interested solely in using Ukraine as a pawn to weaken Russia, in the words of our defense secretary. He said a year and a half ago, "No, our aim is to weaken Russia, and we will move heaven and earth to do so." His words. So it's no secret how callous. I mean, when you talk about 50,000 people dead, I'm reminded of what's her name, Madeline Albright, former Secretary of State under Clinton and actually former ambassador to the UN. When she was asked by Leslie Stahl, the reporter, "Do you think that the death of 50,000 young Iraqis under the age of 5 because of the sanctions, do you think that was worth it?" And Albright automatically said, "Yeah, I think it was worth it." It's hard fact, but I think, my God, worth it. So what I'm saying here is that the world at large, and even Europe now, is coming to the realization that this is not about them. This is not about Ukraine. This is about using Europe to weaken Russia. Now, where's the irony here? This, I think, is an interesting footnote. About 2 months ago, Biden called his advisors and said, "Look, I'm told that the Ukrainians are running out of 155 millimeter shells for their howitzers, for their tanks. So let's give them some bars." Now, his advisors, let's say it's Defense Secretary Austin. "Well, Mr. President, I'm sorry, but we can't do that." "Why not?" "Oh, well, actually, we're really, really low ourselves. We have to keep some for ourselves." Okay. Whoa, huh? Well, yeah, well, we have this cluster ammunition, which is same 155 millimeter. We'll give them that. Okay, well, give them that. Did they tell them that 110 foreign countries have banned cluster ammunitions under an international accord because of the harm they do to people decades after they don't explode? No, they tell them that. So they did. So they gave them the cluster ammunition. Now, my point is simply this: what happens when they run out of cluster ammunition? Whoa, well, up in the the top shelf here with the big padlock. Those are little mini nukes, Mr. President. We don't like to use these things, but you know, contrary to what we told you, we're losing badly in Ukraine. The election is coming up. We can't possibly afford to lose the election. I mean, if that redheaded guy comes in, my God, he'll put us all in jail for what we did, according to court testimony. So, yeah, let's use one of these little mini nukes, and maybe that will give those bad Russians pause. Okay, that's one thing that worries me. The other thing that really should be brought into light is why is it? Why in heaven were our planners not as provident as the Vestal Virgins in Matthew? You know, some of them ran out of oil. They didn't bring enough oil to the wedding, and so they missed out on a whole damn thing, right? Okay, well, hello. If, and that's capital IF, if Russia is a threat to the West, if it wants to take over not only Ukraine, but Poland and the Baltic, well, you would think that NATO and the US would have kind of built up their basic ammunition, 155 millimeter shells but they didn't. Why didn't they? Because Russia was no threat. 2014, Russia, after the coup in Kiev, which your listeners know about, Russia all of a sudden became a rhetorical threat. Now, that's 9 years ago. Did we not have time to build up 155 millimeter shells for 9 years? No, we didn't really think that. So give me a break. Those who say that Russia, like Fiona Hill, the famous one who studied under Richard Pipes at Harvard, I have just one sentence quote from her. New York Times, January of a year ago. The title was Mr. Putin has American presidents right where he wants them. And the graphic shows 5 US presidents, the most recent ones, including Biden, sort of cowering and Putin shutting the door. Okay. So what's her sentence here? This time, Putin's aim is bigger than just closing NATO's open door to Ukraine. He wants to evict the United States from Europe. As he puts it, goodbye, America. Don't let the door hit you on the way out, period. Quatsch. I mean, the British would call that rubbish, okay? And yet she's the one that was the national intelligence officer just about 15 years ago and determined who's going to be analyzing Russian foreign policy. So we're in bad shape. And we can talk about the additional problems with respect to funding of Ukraine and also with respect to impeachment, if you like. But those all fit into the calculus. And no one is more aware than Mr. Putin that, as he put it one time, U.S. foreign policy and military policy is hostage, his word, to U.S. domestic political requirements.
Yeah. Let's stay on the topic of Putin. You probably saw this just a few days ago in an interview. He said that as a global leader, as somebody living in Russia, formerly the USSR, he's watching what's happening to Donald Trump and what's happening with the Biden impeachment. And he said that he couldn't believe that the United States would play out on the global stage, going after a political enemy and trying to lock up a political enemy, ruin the businesses of a political enemy. Meanwhile, Biden, the impeachment inquiries are showing there's definitely a connection between him and getting a lot of money from Russia and Ukraine and China. So Putin is watching this and he is like, wait a minute, this kind of stuff happened in Russia, not the United States. Here's Russia now watching, but also the global world is watching what's happening. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if I could do what I've been doing for 50 years, and that is put myself in the position of a Soviet leader or a Russian leader in Putin's case, I would have to be very, very concerned. Um, the volatility in US politics is going to cut one way or the other. I think Putin and his advisors are inclined to sit back and watch what happens. In the next couple of days, it'll be clear whether Ukraine, the military aid to Ukraine, will continue under the legislation that is now in progress, or it won't. The next 2 days will determine whether the U.S. government will shut down, or it won't. Talking about disarray, the need for a foreign enemy has never been so acute. And Mr. Biden is, as I say, in personal jeopardy. I mean, not only his son, but the president himself. Now, there's lots of information out there. People think of the impeachment process as a political maneuver. Well, I don't see it that way. I think when the majority in the House move toward impeachment, that's what they should do under the Constitution. It's another matter as to whether the people are convicted or even charged, but the Senate will, of course, decide that. But the disarray is destabilizing. And I dare say that with generals and admirals saying, well, these little nukes are okay. They're only about a fraction of what we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, there's a degree of unreality that the Russians have to be very, very finely attuned to. And I imagine they have their defensive forces and offensive forces at high alert. And just one comment here, their offensive forces used to be inferior to ours. Mark my words, they're no longer inferior. Many of their new missiles fly at Mach 7, 8, 9. When you're old like me, you could say, well, I remember when it was something that could fly like a jet fighter at the speed of sound. That's Mach. Mach 3. Whoa, that's really something. This is Mach 7, 8, 9, 10, if you will. No defense against them. And even Joe Biden has admitted there's no defense against some of the missiles that have been fired by Russia at various key points in Ukraine. So the strategic situation is not any longer so well balanced. And the Russians, I think, would be the last to threaten to use these things. But U.S. perceptions are that all these Russians are just a gas station with nuclear weapons and, they can't do anything. If that perception persists, and if I were Putin, I have to sort of assume that it does, well, it makes the whole situation very, very, very violently, what's the word? The Germans use labil. It means explosive. It could be set off at any point.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that Russia and China are strong allies now?
Yes, it is. And this is the tectonic shift in relations.
Okay, so thank you for setting that up. Okay, so Russia is fighting Ukraine. China gave permission for Russia to fight Ukraine. Russia and China are strong allies. The United States is borrowing money from China to give to Ukraine so that their partner, Russia, can continue to beat them up. Like, this doesn't make any sense. The American taxpayer is fronting money and taking on debt that we can't take or we can't pay for from China to fight Russia's enemy. Like, China is probably like, we're making a killing. This is the greatest war ever. Am I wrong? Like, I was thinking about this morning.
Well, Stephen, it sounds to me that you're kind of out of the ordinary person. You seem to know something about finance and economics and borrowing and facts that when you borrow something, you have to repay it. $33 billion in debt? Uh, you know, it doesn't make any sense unless you're a US politician and can think in a very, very short term of 2 years or 4 years or 6 years at the most. So yeah, it just doesn't it doesn't parse that we would be borrowing money from China to make arms to give to Ukraine and then make more arms when those things are destroyed. I mean, there is one element of our society that is really liking this, and that is the arms people, the arms traders, the arms merchants. And I like to harken back to what Pope Francis said when he came to a joint session of the U.S. Congress. It was 2015, if memory serves. And, it was quite amazing. Everybody, of course, really happy to see the Pope. But what he said was, and I quote, "The main problem in this world is the blood-drenched arms trade, period," end quote. And what happened was all these representatives and senators got up as one and then they looked into their pockets to see if the latest envelope from Raytheon was there, and the one from Lockheed and General Dynamics. It was giving hypocrisy a bad name. So these people are profiteering from this. Even the automobile manufacturers, a lot of our folks are on strike now, the automaker folks, and they're trying to get a decent deal when the CEO, some woman, I forget her name, is making something like $25 million a year. I mean, hello, that's what's happening. There's wealth created, but it's all going to the top echelon of the arms makers, the automakers. Whoever makes stuff still in the United States is profiteering. Joe Blow, average citizen, not only not so much, but losing out on this whole thing. And hopefully our democracy is strong enough so that the average citizen will finally figure out what's going on and do something about it, hopefully as soon as November of next year.
Yeah. Final question. I know we're limited on time, but the World Bank announced in the last couple of days that it's going to take, at a minimum, $411 billion to rebuild Ukraine. Where is that money going to come from? That's 100 times more than the budget of the United Nations. 100 times more. Who's going to pay for that? That's at a minimum. Some of the the JP Morgans, the BlackRock, the Blackstone, they're saying it's going to cost over $1 trillion. Is it the U.S. taxpayer that's going to pay for this, or what are your thoughts on that? It's an enormous amount of money.
It is, Stephen, but we're really clever. We're going to borrow it from China. No, you have to realize that Monsanto and other people involved in agriculture have cornered the market on a large portion of Ukraine's wealth. And you can grow crops in Ukraine at the drop of a hat. So a lot of this is going to go on whether or not Ukraine is reconstructed ever, and whether parts of Ukraine are ever made viable again. I think they can be made viable, but what needs to happen now is a ceasefire, stop the bleeding, get down to the table, and talk before it's too late. Stephen, I know we're at the end here, but I have one other thing that I'd like to add that I think might be of general interest, since this is the same week exactly 1 year ago when the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up.
Yeah.
Now,
Cyhurst just came out with new details, so tell us about it.
That's right. Yeah. Well, Cy makes the point that it had nothing to do with Ukraine. It had to do with making sure that Russia and Germany and the rest of Europe didn't have these unsavory close contacts where Germany thrived economically and so did Russia. So What am I saying here? I'm saying here that I found out a couple of weeks ago that Tony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, studied under a fellow named Richard Pipes, who is the was the epitome of a Russophobe uh, refugee from Poland at Harvard. The same guy who taught Professor Hill, what's her name? Uh, the woman I quoted before. I
Fiona
can
Hill.
never remember. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Okay.
Okay.
So so I found out that Tony Blinken, having studied under Richard Pipes and others at Harvard, wrote a dissertation to get out of to get his bachelor's degree. And what's the name of this dissertation? It's Ally versus Ally: America, Europe, and the Siberian pipeline crisis. Whoa, isn't that interesting? So he's writing about the mid 80s and how it really was dangerous to have Siberian gas and oil coming into Western Europe. This is before Nord Stream, okay? So here's just one little sentence or two from he says, Ronald Reagan was convinced that the Europeans could be persuaded to follow America no matter what, okay? Then he says, Richard Pipes, the fellow Fiona Hill's professor and his professor, Richard Pipes, former National Security Advisor for Soviet Affairs, put it frankly. He said, quote, we saw no reason in continually deferring, as has been done in the past, to the Europeans. We always humor them. They never humor us. Enough was enough, period, unquote. Okay, well, right after the pipeline was blown, what did Tony Blinken say? This is a wonderful, wonderful situation because no longer will Western Europe be dependent on Russia for this key commodity. Uh, he bragged about it, okay? And as you know, the president himself warned that this would happen if Russia invaded Ukraine. So what I'm saying here is that this is I had to invest $90 to get this copy, okay? But it's worth reading because here is Tony Blinken informed by these Russophobes to thinking that no, they have to be kept out of Western Europe and everywhere else. And he writes it down. He says Ronald Reagan thought we could do this. He was right. And Richard Pipes says he was right. Enough is enough of deferring to the Europeans. So, bottom line, we're going to see what happens this winter. This winter is likely to be a lot colder than last winter. The heating prices are already about 5 times higher than they were before the pipeline explosion. One pipeline is still intact. How long will Olaf Scholz, Chancellor of Germany, be able to say no, we can't open that pipeline? No, we'll be okay. We'll be all right. We'll buy liquefied natural gas from the U.S. and maybe even from Russia. Give me a break. It just doesn't parse, and Europeans are smart enough to know which end is up. So all they have to do is read Tony Blinken's dissertation, and you will see that he was trained to think in these terms. So does Jacob Sullivan, who went to the same fancy schools. It reminds me, for those of you with some gray in your hair, of what David Habelstrom of the New York Times called in his book, The Best and the Brightest, who came from exactly the same elite schools, got us involved in Vietnam, and couldn't possibly imagine that these brown, bare-feeted people in South Vietnam could ever counter or defeat the United States. The exceptionalism thing continues and continues specifically with these fellows. And now they have an extra reason, a personal stake to make sure that they don't lose this election for personal as well as professional reasons.
Yeah. As we end here, I'm picking up on a pattern. The Biden administration wanted to control Germany by not giving them access to affordable energy. In the United States, the Biden administration wants to control the American people by not giving us access to affordable energy. The pattern is becoming clearer and clearer. Ray McGovern, if people want to follow you, is raymcgovern.com the best way to do that?
I'm also on Twitter at Ray McGovern. So yeah, either way is good. And thanks for inviting me again, Steve. And I think you're performing a really valuable social service here to allow us, such as we are, to get our voices heard by at least one segment of the population.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for coming on. Have a great rest of your day.
And you too, Stephen.